But we had the Schultzes, Lola, Devin, and I spent a week in Florida. We went to SeaWorld, we went to the beach, and then on Thursday morning, we piled the kids into the car at 5 a.m. and didn't tell them where we were going. And at about 8 o'clock, we pulled onto the drive of Disney. And so at 8 o'clock in the morning, we finally kind of let them figure out where we were at. Now, I don't know if it's because I come from the generation that saw one too many of those Disney commercials, but I decided that this morning I didn't want to just tell you about how my kids responded to finding out that we were going to Disney. I actually shot a video on my phone. And so I am going to show you the video of my children discovering that they were going to Disney. Alex?
They would just pick their head up from their...
No,
look up.
Look up.
Hey, guys, what does that say?
Disney World.
Where are we at?
Disney World.
Lola, where are we?
Disney World.
Hey guys, we're going to Disney World.
Yes! Finally. Thank you. I only did this when I was a baby.
I wanted so bad.
I'm gonna turn off my tablet.
Oh, wow. You know, we have different responses to good news, don't we? Some of us, you really had a hard time seeing it, but some of us can kind of have that. Noah had that like big smile on his face, but it was kind of all kept inside. It was just that big smile. And you know, some people have that kind of response. Other people can be like my Lola, and that is nothing stays inside with my Lola. And so everybody knew exactly how she was feeling. I'm pretty sure in Georgia, they knew exactly how Lola was feeling. And some of us tend to respond to good news by crying. Well, Devin was actually crying because he wanted my phone, so he was getting irritated. So you see him at the end, he's like reaching for my phone. Well, as we kind of are moving through Acts, what we quickly learn is that in the story of Acts, people respond to the good news of Jesus in very different ways. A couple weeks ago, Jim Kent came and preached for us, and he talked about Saul. Now, Saul's initial response to the good news of Jesus was not only disbelief, but was persecution. And when he came face to face with Jesus, his life was changed. And it's through him, and he is told that the message, the good news, is now to be delivered to the Gentile people. Well, Paul isn't the only person who received that message. As we get into Acts 11 is where we find out that Peter himself also receives this revelation from God. And in that revelation, he is offered the opportunity to go and to be the one to share the message with Cornelius. And so Peter himself is also involved in this incredible new mission to tell the good news to the Gentile people. And so as we are moving on past that story then, we have all of these people hearing this good news, and God is doing incredible things among the believers in so many different ways. But what we can easily forget as we're moving through these next few chapters of Acts is that the reality is that at the same time, underneath the surface, there is persecution still happening. And that persecution bubbles to the surface again at the beginning of Acts 12, which is our passage for this week, when Herod kind of gets a little irritated and decides to execute James, who is an apostle and who is also the brother of John. Well, what happens is the Jewish people, who really tend to not like Herod very much, they decide that that was such a good thing. And Herod decides that he is so happy about the fact that they are happy, because they don't usually like him, so he's won favor with them. He thinks he's going to try it again. And so that is how Peter ends up in jail, is because Herod has decided he wants to try this whole winning favor by killing a Christian thing again. And so that becomes the underlying kind of setting for our story for this morning. The story which you've already heard, but what I want to invite you to read along with me. So I want to invite you to turn to page 896 in your pew Bibles. We're going to start with verse 5 of Acts 12, which is 3 lines above that heading, Peter delivered from prison. And I'll invite you to follow along as I read. Again, we're starting Acts 12, and we'll be reading 5 through 17, not 19. While Peter was kept in prison, the church prayed fervently to God for him. The very night before Herod was going to bring him out, Peter, bound with 2 chains, was sleeping between 2 soldiers while guards in the front door were keeping watch over the prison. Suddenly an angel of the Lord appeared and a light shone in the cell. He tapped Peter on the side and woke him up, saying, "Get up quickly." And the chains fell off his wrists. Then the angel said to him, Fasten your belt and put on your sandals." He did so. Then he said to him, "Wrap your cloak around you and follow me." Peter went out and followed him. And he did not realize that what was happening with the angel was real. He thought he was seeing a vision. After they had passed the first and the second guard, they came to the iron gate leading into the city. It opened for them of its own accord, and they went outside and walked along the lane, when suddenly the angel left him. Then Peter came to himself and said, "Now I am sure that the Lord has sent his angel and rescued me from the hands of Herod and from all that the Jewish people were expecting." As soon as he realized this, he went to the house of Mary, the mother of John, whose name was Mark, where many had gathered and were praying. When he knocked at the outer gate, a maid named Rhoda came to answer. On recognizing Peter's voice, she was so overjoyed, instead of opening the gate, she ran in and announced that Peter was standing at the gate. They said to her, "You're out of your mind." But she insisted that it was so. They said, "It is an angel." Meanwhile, Peter continued knocking, and when they opened the gate, they saw him and were amazed. He motioned to them with his hand to be silent and described for them how the Lord had brought him out of the prison. And he added, "Tell this to James and to the believers." Then he left and went to another place. Talk about an unbelievable story. I mean, you just see God so present and active in this story. We have believers praying and their prayers being answered. We have this incredible kind of miracle of chains falling off and doors being opened. It's just amazing. And what we see is just like there were 3 different responses from the children about going to Disney, we have 3 different responses in this passage from the believers about what God is doing. And so this morning, I want to invite you to kind of walk back through this story with me, a little bit less actively than what Karen did. But we're going to walk back through the story from one person to the next and ask the question, how did they respond? And how does their response challenge us this morning when we see God working in our lives? So let's start with the main character of the story. It's a good place to start, right? We have Peter. Now think about who Peter is. Peter has been with Jesus. He has been kind of one of the central figures in the stories so far. And so when God is on the move, Peter has tended to be present in the midst of all of it. And here we have Peter again in the midst of all of it. And you would think that if anybody could figure out that God was on the move, it was going to be Peter, because he had seen it all before. And what I love about this story is, well, one of the things that I love about this story is how Peter is so Peter in this story. Peter is so Peter because here he is, the chains are falling off, the doors are opening, and it takes until he is outside the city walls to go, that just happened. Seriously. He just kind of looks back and he realizes what God has done. You know, that's a pretty typical response, isn't it, when God's hand is on the move? Sometimes we're just so in the middle of it that we can't see what God is doing. So Peter then gets to the gate, or gets to this house where everybody has been praying. And the next character that we meet, this, supporting role, as they would say, kind of in the Emmys, there's this supporting role, and the supporting role is of Rhoda. And Rhoda is a servant girl, and I bet she's been in that house all night long. I bet that she has heard every single prayer and has probably prayed herself for Peter. And so she knows what's been prayed. And Rhoda goes to the door, and when she gets to that door and she hears Peter's voice, her immediate response is belief. And she is so excited that she leaves Peter at the door. Now, this is not a very good rescue situation, is it? You tend to not want to leave the person who has just escaped from prison standing outside your door. But she does it. She runs in and she gets all excited. And what I love about Rhoda's response is that Rhoda's response challenges us because it's kind of that incredible response of faith, isn't it? She doesn't even see Peter, but she knows that God has answered her prayers. And she responds by going out and telling everybody she can find. And her response is met by a third response. And that's the response of the praying believers. Now, these people have been praying all night long. But I want you to think about the setting that we talked about when we started. The setting of their prayers is that they most likely had just recently been praying for James, right? James had been imprisoned, and what happened to James? James was executed. So here you have a group of believers who have just experienced that pain of saying, God, please, please, and having their prayers unanswered. Is it any wonder that when Rhoda comes in and says, guess who's at the door? Their first response isn't, Peter? Instead, it's, you're crazy. Don't you know God doesn't really answer prayers? I don't know about you, but for me, when I look at this list, I see a list of my own responses to God's hand in my life. I see how God himself has done amazing things and how I too can be the one who goes through a situation and I get way past it and then I go, look what God was doing. Isn't that amazing? I've had the experience of being in the midst of something and getting excited and telling people, look at what God is doing. And I'm going to be honest. I've also had that, I don't really believe it. I don't believe that God actually answered my prayer. I don't believe that God would answer my prayers. As believers, we kind of set Rhoda as that standard, don't we? Or maybe it's just me. I'm a little bit of a perfectionist. I don't know if you know that about me. A little bit of a perfectionist. And so when I live a Christian life, I want to live like the perfect Christian life. So for me, I kind of set that Rhoda standard. And I get disappointed when I have a Peter response or a believer response. And I tend to want to hide it when that happens. Maybe you can relate. Maybe you can relate that anything less than Rhoda seems not good, bad, less than Christian. But I wonder if in categorizing everything else as bad, as trying to hide it, as trying to kind of brush it off, if we miss out on God's transforming work in our life. Because you see, when God is present, lives are changed, right? And when we're aware of God's work, lives are changed. But sometimes it's not as easy as that. For me, it's like Rhoda's the A, and I want straight A's, I was that kid. And Peter was like the C, and the cynical believers were like the F. And for those of you going back to school, no one wants an F. And a C for me was never good enough. I wanted the straight A's. But what if it's not a ranking system, A through F? What if it's a sliding scale? What if instead of worrying about that perfect response, we realize that God is able to take every response and make something good out of it? So what good comes out of the praying believer's cynicism? Go ahead and go to that next slide there for me, Alex. God can do something in our lives when, first of all, we acknowledge it. As believers, I've noticed, maybe it's just me, but I think I've known other people like me who tend to not want to admit that I can be cynical. I want to have that incredible faith. And I think one of the ways that we're allowed to grow, one of the ways that God moves in our lives is when we just own it. I'm being really cynical right now. Because it's in that admission that God is able to work, because we're done faking it and we're starting to be real about where we're at. And that's when God can work. And when we're able to acknowledge that, we can get down to the root. Why am I cynical? Is it because I've been hurt? It's because I need to go to God and say, I got a bone to pick with you. I got a bone to pick with you, God, because the last time I prayed, you didn't answer my prayer. Sometimes I think we can hurt God's feelings. You ever thought that? Sometimes I think I can hurt God's feelings by being honest with him about where I'm at, like he's not already aware. Acknowledging my own responses to God actually just opens up the door. It's like the kid who breaks the plate and they were the only one in the house and they want to blame it on anybody else. You know what's wrong. You know they did it. But you can't really go through any lessons until they're willing to admit it, right? Well, God's that way. God's like, I know you're being cynical. I know you have an issue with me right now. Stop pussyfooting around it. Now let's deal with it. And when we do that, we get to work through. And transformation is possible because we're able to work through and come to that point where maybe it's not the situation where God's been at work, but the ability to work through why we couldn't see it, where God does amazing things in our life. So then what happens about Peter? How about this C-level response? What happens if, for a lot of us, for me at least, I can have this experience of I'm just overwhelmed. Sometimes I am overwhelmed in the situation that I'm in. Have you ever been like that? Or quite frankly, you are just up to here and you can't see God because you're just barely keeping your head above water. Now that's kind of a normal response, right? That's a human response. No one guilts you for that. But I wonder how many times in my life I use that as a crutch for not asking that hard question of what's keeping me from seeing God. So I want to invite you this morning to consider the fact that maybe it was being overwhelmed, and if so, there is nothing wrong with that. But what would happen if you just stopped and asked the question, God, was I really overwhelmed, or was something else at play here? Something else that we need to work on. And to let that be a way that God works in our life. The important thing about the relationship with God that we have, the important thing about God working in our lives isn't when we realize that God is at work. It's if we can realize that God is at work. And so instead of being worried about this perfect response and wanting to be just like Rhoda, let's just worry about being open to the movement of a God who, quite frankly, is always on the move. who is always working in us and through us and around us. And instead of getting caught up in all of the little details and wanting the straight A's and letting our own woundedness get in the way, maybe we should just open ourselves up to being real with a God who, quite frankly, already knows what's going on and who wants to be in a real, authentic relationship with us and wants us to be part of his work in the kingdom. Would you pray with me? Lord, I thank you for being a God who is forever at work among us. Lord, that you, since the beginning of creation, have been at work to restore this kingdom to its full glory. And so, Lord, we come this morning and we just ask that you would be present with us and that we could see your hand working among us. Lord, whether that requires the working through and processing and being honest with where we're at, or whether that's just getting excited and letting ourselves be excited like Rhoda and have that kind of faith. Lord, I thank you for meeting us right where we are. And that no matter how on our side we respond, you are forever willing to be the God who transforms us, renews us, restores us, and invites us to work with you in your kingdom. Amen.